My presentation is on the Smoking Life Restricted, and my plan is to speak to the audience about what smoking restrictions really do and how they benefit our community as a whole. Smoking is something that 1,000 people always do, and they'll try to obtain it at any cost, and they won't care what it does to their community. People are aware of the effects that smoking has on other people, whether it's secondhand smoking or in any other way, but they just choose to continue to do it because they enjoy it. Studies have been conducted to show how effective smoking restrictions are and how high the compliance rate is, and why that it's important that we have smoking restrictions for the rest of our community. I will be speaking on the importance of smoking restrictions, the compliance rate, and how effective they are in today's community. So why restrictions are important. Elena Raptu, the author of Support of Tobacco Control, states that it's important for people to not be exposed to secondhand smoke because it causes morbidity and mortality in young adults, infants, and children. Children who are diagnosed with cancer are more likely to develop pulmonary and respiratory problems when being exposed to SHS. And Vita Teich, a professor at the School of Psychology, explains that secondhand smoke has a greater effect on children who have been diagnosed with cancer. Teich says that smoking restrictions have helped adults in their communities, but they haven't helped the children because they can still be exposed to that smoke through home or through vehicle rides, anything like that that can cause them to be surrounded by that smoke that is being exhaled by their parents or friends or family. So in order to make a difference in the community, it's really important that the restrictions are being enforced and are being that people are being held accountable for what they are doing to others. Elena Raptu also found that non-smokers are not as willing to give up their smoking rights or give those restrictions a chance because they just enjoy smoking and they don't really care about other people who are being exposed to it. But she also finds that people who don't smoke, they are for a better smoking restriction, and people who hold a better diet, that they're much more willing to comply with those restrictions and that they like the idea of having those restrictions. Young adults are not as likely to be interested in them, or minors or teenagers, they don't really care because as soon as they turn 18, it's a new experience that they get to have. It's one of those new freedoms of becoming an adult, so they're not as for it. But Michael K. Cummings, a doctor who specializes in internal medicine, has found that people don't care about smoking restrictions because it wasn't ever focused on until the 1950s. Medical research was never done until then, and basically how smoking really got around was media started to focus on it and started to focus on the bad health that it gives towards other people who don't smoke. So Cummings created a study that questioned consumers about whether or not they knew what they were doing to themselves. He found that, shockingly, many people were unaware of what they were truly doing to themselves, and they didn't really care to find out about what they were doing to themselves. He also found that most of those people were really over-optimistic about their health. They figured, oh, just because I've been smoking doesn't mean that I'm going to be one of those patients that ends up having cancer because of this. This isn't my fault. Like, this is smoking. It's not going to ruin my body. But that is very much so a lie in and of itself. And the only way that smoking restrictions will become more effective is if people are willing to comply. The big issue that they've been struggling with is, will people comply with this law and do they care? And that's something that a lot of people have focused on with research, is trying to figure out whether or not people will comply, if young people will comply, because it's not going to truly work unless someone does comply to it, and that starts to domino effect, and then other people follow those rules and they see that that's really benefiting their health. So it is more important that people comply with restrictions being put in place, because that's the only way that this is actually going to work. Nancy Rigotti, a Harvard Medical School graduate, she created her own study over a town called Brookline, and she surveyed 353 offices and buildings to figure out how their compliance rate was going with the new law. In Brookline, a law had just been put in place a month before she started her study, and it was a new restriction that had just been put in place for that smoking, that people weren't allowed to smoke around buildings or in buildings. And so that's whenever she began to do her study. So she waited for a while She waited about a year, and then after she waited that year, she found that more people were aware of the law that was being put in place, because when the law was first put in place, only 36% of people were actually aware of what was happening, and they didn't really care at the same time. So that was a difficult time because people were semi-aware of it, but other people had no idea what was going on. So after that year had gone by, she found that 65% of the town was in favor of the smoking restriction, which is very impressive considering 36% only knew about it in the beginning, and now 65% is willing to comply with it. 23% was neutral on the idea. They didn't really care. They might have been smokers, but they were okay with the new restrictions, but it didn't really matter to them at the same time. And then only 12% was against these new restrictions, which was quite impressive for me, because for a whole town to just be against it is very unlikely. So I liked to see that it was a very low number for the people who did not like the restrictions, but they complied to it still, so that was a great after effect. So after the new restrictions were put in place, 3 incidents had only happened, which was very impressive because you might expect more to have happened after that whole year, but only 3 instances had been seen where they were struggling with complying to it. So then Amanda Fallon, she has discovered that students are also very aware of these new laws put in place, and they actually enjoy it a lot more. So people would see smokers around campus, and that went from 95% to 55%. And the experience for secondhand smoke went from 81% to 39%. And this shows that smoking can be affected very easily, and that it just takes one person to help with that. So many studies have been in collecting the importance of these smoking rates and how it helps their community and the compliance rate. Smoking is something that the world is always going to struggle with, but we can always help to strive to make it better as long as we just keep pushing for those restrictions to be put through. Thank you.